Thank you everyone for tuning in to yet another episode in which I talk about issues related to public transport. And today, as promised, I want to discuss the concept of solarpunk, just because I got involved with some people in the movement in Germany, and then there are people that I know have been doing this for quite a while. So if you're watching this and you have some kind of American public transport activist or housing, let's say YIMBY background, I consider Alfred Twu to be solarpunk in many ways. So I'm trying to think. So things like this. So solarpunk is specifically aesthetic, and I'm like literally showing you what it is. The idea is you're depicting a positive future. So I'm just showing you the website of a certain graphic artist and housing advocate. They live. I forget where they live. They live in the Bay Area. I don't remember where. I think somewhere East Bay, but I can't tell whether like Oakland, Emeryville, Berkeley, Richmond, anywhere like that. And so note that, for example, they kind of show you how a city could look with more, dense housing, and just look at what they're showing with the missing large housing. Things like specifically how. I mean, there's a very specific reason why the highest density form here is called Public Sector Developers Housing Development Boards, which is, Singapore. So it's the idea is to depict a future which is again positive, usually something with climate change having been resolved. So what is it like to live in, let's say, 2100 when climate is no longer a pressing concern? And often it's bundled into other things, and this is where I want to start getting into the aesthetic a little bit, because these are pretty ordinary streets, but if I Google solarpunk, which I did just before starting, which I did on stream just before recording, I got this, and I got this, so these are people describing the movement. You can click through if you want. And the thing is, for me, less so this picture, by the way, much more so this picture. This picture, when I see this, including the train that's not actually a train, it's on tires. It's like a guideway. But there are also, on the other side, there are platform screen doors at what looks like the station. And these buildings, especially the part where there's a little bit of greenery on top of a glass building, yeah, that makes me think Singapore. I think the mountain here is not like what I would expect. The species of, these do not look to me like tropical trees. I'm not sure. The foreground looks like it's a different biome, but this is there are buildings in Singapore that are like this, designed by star architects, and they don't make me think, oh cool, it's solar park, and they make me think, oh my god, how much money got wasted on pretending you live in nature and not in fucking Singapore. Now, and then again, it's all about climate optimism, and I bring up Singapore for a reason, and the reason is that Singapore is the developed country with by far the lowest car use. This is a country where I can show you GDP per capita, but it's going to be fake news because it's a city-state, so it's a lot of they're commuters. They're commuters from Malaysia working in Singapore. Their income is Singapore's GDP, but not the capita. Lots and lots of foreign corporations. No, I shouldn't say foreign. Corporations are HQ'd in Singapore, but the dividends and the capital gains don't go to people who live in Singapore. They're still part of the GDP of Singapore. This is also why Ireland if you look at GDP per capita, Ireland is very wealthy, and then you look at per capita income, and it really isn't. I think Ireland is maybe. I mean, you want to. I mean, I'm not going to check this on the stream, but this is what you want to check. Primary balance of income is essentially income from work, and yeah, Ireland. I want to say my recollection of Ireland is that it is maybe Italy, maybe a bit richer than Italy, poorer than anywhere in Northern Europe or France, or if you count it as not Northern Europe, Belgium. So yeah. So anyway, but anyway, Singapore really is wealthy. Just the GDP will make it look wealthier than it is. It's maybe U.S. levels of wealth, of like per capita income, I think. Like per capita income from work is what I have for Singapore and the US. And then the inequality in Singapore is somewhat worse than the United States. This is a country that basically has American affordability of cars in theory. In practice, cars are so heavily taxed that they have, I believe, 150 motor vehicles per 1,000 people. 30% of households in Singapore own a car. For most of them, it's just one car for the family, not one car per adult. This is the only place in the United States that gets that is Manhattan. Paris does not get that. Paris, I believe, is 210 motor vehicles per 1,000 people. New York writ large is 250, I believe. Berlin is maybe a little over 300. So very low car usage. Now, despite increases in income, which are going to like a lot of materialism, Singapore is an incredibly materialistic society. You would expect that maybe over time the country would get more auto-oriented with growth. I think this is what's happening to Hong Kong from a much lower level. But it actually isn't. So this is I've seen similar numbers for like the 2010s in Singapore, and I saw model splits. So what proportion of Singaporeans get to work by public transport versus driving? Basically, the cars are basically always used. The system in Singapore is based so much on taxing the purchase of the car that if you have a car, it's actually pretty convenient. Like there's lots of parking, the roads are not very congested because not a lot of people have cars. There's also congestion pricing, but it's not at a very high rate. The congestion charges in London and soon to be New York are much larger, for example. But anyway, the model split in Singapore, I'm forgetting whether just before Corona or just after, was 58%, or 50, no, it was 56% of Singaporeans were getting to work on public transit. It was maybe 58, 59% for the bottom, I think 80 something percent of the income distribution, and then for the top, I'm forgetting what, 10 or 15 or 20%, it was still mid 40s, so still pretty high, but some of them just own cars. Yeah, neither Singapore nor Hong Kong can really build at this point. They both are in stiff competition for worst construction costs outside New York City. But they're still trying. There's a limit to what they can do. At any rate, so in Singapore, very high usage of public transport, so 56% roughly as the model split. And that was also the case in the 2000s. So at least in the roughly decade for which I have diachronic data, it stayed the same. Again, incredibly materialistic culture. To be clear, I wouldn't call Singapore a very climate conscious society because so much of the recreation there is flying. It's really important to Singaporean recreation to fly. It's kind of the substitute of driving to wherever and like living in the suburbs far away from people. So there is that kind of trade-off, which I think matters. It's just not counted in its emissions because international flying is not counted in any country's emissions, which fibs about the sustainability of specific places. But the point is that like its domestic transport system is Again, it has a lot of problems, like inequality, but it is green. And again, the Solarpunk vision is never that. The Solarpunk vision is not like cyberpunk levels of inequality and corporate control of the workers, um, including, for example, a culture where they have the same brutal working hours that are familiar from Japanese and Korean salaryman systems, but in Japan, I'm not sure about Korea, but in Japan, it's reciprocal. The rule is you put in the hours as a salaryman, or maybe salaryman, but mostly salaryman. You put in the hours, you stay late, you go to mandatory after hours drinking with your coworkers, and you'd better keep up with your boss. But in exchange, you will never get fired. And in Singapore, it's basically the same except for the drinks. They don't have much of a drinking culture, but you can be fired at will, like in America. No, Singapore is kind of disgustingly high inequality, and it's very in your face. And the government literally has posters at not the government. I'm not actually sure whether Changi is at this point privatized or still publicly owned. But the point is that at the airport at Changi, there are posters that, for some reason, are visible to the passengers, telling the employees to smile more. So again, tolerance of very high. No, I should say tolerance of very high inequality. I don't think they think of the inequality as, well, they need that to incentivize business, and therefore it's more important to work with growth. They don't think the inequality is something bad that they're doing for growth. They think of it as natural and good. And I say this just because this specific aesthetic is something that I have seen there. I saw it when I was last there, which was just before Corona. I'm forgetting whether I told people that story, that I was visiting on the same trip, end of 19, beginning of 20, Thailand, Taiwan, Singapore. And in Thailand, I started feeling sick. I didn't know whether I'd caught something on the plane, or whether it actually had a respiratory infection, or whether I just had a bad reaction to how polluted Bangkok air was, and then I flew sick without a mask because it was 2019 to Taipei, and I was and I was sneezing the entire time, like going through like multiple boxes of tissues and toilet paper at the hotel room, and then flew to Singapore, and took me maybe 2 weeks, which was pretty bad cold. And then a couple days later, I read about this Wuhan flu, and for a few moments, I'm thinking, wait, Taiwan is saying that. Is it me? No. I mean, obviously, I could not have been patient zero for Corona, now that we know. But I did have that, wait, was that me reaction to an illness that I took a few days to understand was a thing just because of polluted Thai air. And my point is that in Singapore, on that trip, I don't think I saw a cluster of buildings like this, but I saw at least one building that had these trees on the balconies, just to look green, and like basically everything else in Singapore looked kind of tacky. Yeah. So it's kind of a thing where I think there is some room for so to be fair, I do think there is some room for climate optimism. Let's stop dumping on Singapore for a moment. Like it's a country of 6 million, like 5-6 million people, and so people talk about the aesthetic of climate optimism, and I think it's pretty good, but also at the end of the day, okay, like it's not necessarily going to be buildings that look like this. Like, I mean, again, there's this building in Singapore that if you because it's been a couple of years, if someone had told me that this is a picture of that building, I would have believed you. And so this is not so like this little bit of greenery is not in any way relevant to climate. I would, if anything, suggest that a building with glass panels probably isn't what you want for climate conscious construction. But at any rate, like the point is that a world that is resolving climate change is a world in which climate change is not perceived as an important issue anymore. In the same way that I don't think anyone talks much today about the ozone hole, because the ozone hole was that building near the Chinatown MRT station. I don't remember. I honestly don't remember. I didn't go to Chinatown in that trip at all. So the answer is maybe I just don't remember. Um, anyway, so like if you write kind of a weird retro future or like a retro utopia story where you write it as if you had been writing in the late 80s, early 90s about what if the ozone hole has been resolved in the 2020s, how genuinely different is it from the 1980s? I mean, yeah, okay, you don't have CFC emissions very much anymore, but it's not like people constantly think about this. It's not like it's not like the industries that have it's not like the things that have replaced CFCs. I think it's ammonia maybe. Are like an important industry that you think about very much. Now, climate is a much bigger problem than the ozone hole. So I can absolutely see stories about um, solar power. In the same way that there is a very famous television series about a rather dumb person who works at a nuclear power plant, and that TV series' name is The Simpsons. And so yeah, it's absolutely a thing. But also I would not call The Simpsons atomic punk. It's a kind of aesthetic that absolutely exists. I would not call The Simpsons that. It's just they needed something in their like generic American town, and so nuclear power. Yeah, okay, like America has nuclear power plant, and it's just not otherwise that it's not otherwise that relevant. And now, not for nothing, the power issue has been basically resolved. In developed countries, at least. In that, at this point, wind and solar are so cheap that they're competitive by themselves. They're being installed as fast as possible based on capital allocation and so on in Europe. The United States lags, but a lot of it is weird issues with transmission and regulations, and this is how Texas, for example, builds more renewable power than California. Texans don't give a shit about climate. They give a shit about making money off of energy. You can make money off of solar and wind, and the regulations in Texas make it easier to build than in California. So it's so that part is basically being resolved, and there's transportation, which is the part that's not really resolved. People talk about EVs a lot, but they're expensive. They consume massive amounts of electricity that needs to actually be produced. Like it's an additional electricity to the grid. And you can maybe say things like, "Oh, if you have an electric car that has enough range for the day, not just for one round trip, then it works okay with wind power because it will recharge overnight." In theory, you can even talk about how the batteries can be used for storage. I don't think that works as well with solar power because the power is being generated during the daytime. But maybe, and then you'll need, I guess, to charge at work during the daytime. You can, but then you're driving back home, if you're driving back home, let's say leave work 5:30, get home 6:30, then half the year it's in the dark and you can't generate power anymore. And what's more, the darkness is coordinated that is to say, in the entire hemisphere, you have the same problem, which means that you can't do each mode covering for the other. Whereas, like the way that they're dealing with the intermittency problem in Northern Europe is HVDC cables between countries, so that when there's wind in one country, it exports electricity, and in particular, it exports electricity to countries with a lot of hydro, like Sweden and Norway. And then when there's no wind, Sweden and Norway let their reservoirs drain. It works really well. The problem is that this also means that Norway has to integrate its electricity market with the rest of Europe. Uh, Pure hydro is very cheap if you can have it, which usually means if you have very low population density, like Norway, Sweden, Canada. Um, and so this means that essentially Norwegians have to compete for electricity with other Europeans, and there's a lot of populism about the evils of having to pay 10 more euros a month for electricity. That's the equivalent of living in the third world or something like that. So, like, I'm not saying that it's a perfectly resolved problem, but it's being resolved. The intermittency has not so far been a huge problem for Germany in the aggregate. Again, we have a majority carbon-free grid at this point, and this is even after the nuclear power plants have been shut down. I believe it's actual HVDC. It's not, I mean, maybe it's new tech in America. Breakthrough is run by people who negatively care about things that happen in Europe. And certainly will not talk about adopting European tech. Not for nothing, for example, they don't touch housing issues because their entire shtick is constant left punching, and EMBism doesn't let them do that. Nor does single state reform. I have no idea. I know that HVDC Grid United Kingdom. Has operated since 1986. Yeah. I have no idea again about the voltages. All I know is that that's what is done to connect British, German, Dutch, Danish, Swedish, Norwegian. I'm not sure whether also Finnish grids. Yeah, so anyway, the point is that that is resolving itself, and transportation really isn't, because EV adoption was supposed to be universal kind of by now, but it isn't. There were plans to just ban the sales of non-electric vehicles by, I think, 2035, and then they're getting delayed, and EPP decided they don't like that. So the EU is not going to do that. And so it really is about improving public transportation. And that's where it kind of conflicts with certain. It's possible. Again, as I said, what I know is that there are HVDC cables. I don't know if it's. And that because it's high voltage, it's supposed to avoid the drop problems. Like the reason AC won over DC is that DC was literally original DC was the grid literally was. I think it was 110 volts, maybe, or I don't actually know if it was 110 or 220, but it was like retail voltage supplied directly from the power plant, and so it would drop too much beyond a couple kilometers from the power plant, so that was less efficient than having an AC plant with wires to like longer distances. And an HVDC avoids the problem of like old-timey Thomas Edison era General Electric DC. Again, I don't know why they're choosing this right now as opposed to anything else. At any rate, the point with public transportation is that it clearly is something in the aesthetic. There's a reason there's a train in the foreground of what I just asked. The thing that I said looked like Singapore. Um, and that clashes with a certain element that I don't think is necessary in Solarpunk, but often co-occurs with it, which is people liking communes and small things. And this is where I have all of these things lined up. So this is Taiwan. So this is so what you want to look at. So it's a post called "On Worshipping Foreign Systems," and the comment is by XH. And you want to look here. And I cannot read Chinese, but I can. But I know certain. But I can like copy paste names of places. These are model splits for public transport by subnational entity in Taiwan by year. So Taiwan follows the epoch of you number years from the formation of the Republic of China. So this is 2016 and this is 2020. So you're seeing the decline. You're seeing some decline in public transport usage because there was a decline during Corona. Now Taiwan was a Corona fortress, but people did do some social distancing early on, and this led to a small decrease in ridership on the Taipei MRT. Again, small, I think maybe 10-15%, but this did happen. So in pre-corona, 18.1% of Taiwan rode public transport to work. It's 18.2 if you only include the island of Taiwan as opposed to like Kinmen or things like that. This is Taipei. This is New Taipei. I think this is Keelung, and then this is Taoyuan, but I'm not sure. I mean, I did the averages for these before here, and you average them weighted by population, and it's 32%. So Taipei, which is auto-oriented by the standards of a rich Asian capital, has a model split of 32%. Again, Singapore is 56%. Seoul is 50%. Tokyo has a lot of different numbers. I think the correct one is about 50 as well. So Hong Kong is higher but declining as, again, materialistic culture and the kind of authoritarianism in Hong Kong buys off some kind of middle class loyalty through material goods, in this case cars. And again, Singapore has the same use of materialism to buy middle class support for the regime, but it's less about cars and more about vacations in cheap places in Southeast Asia. The point is that the secondary cities of Taiwan are kind of shit. So Kaohsiung is 9.3%, Taichung is 12.2%. Now, bear in mind, they're like large American, LA is 5%. So these are not auto-oriented by the standards of like an American kind of cyberpunk aesthetic, which is essentially giant LA forever. So when I think of cyberpunk, I think of three foundational stories. There is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep / Blade Runner, which is explicitly set in LA. There is Neuromancer, which is very much not, but specifically portrays a kind of LAized East Coast of the United States. It's called The Sprawl and stretches from, I think, Boston up to Atlanta. Then there is Snow Crash, which is considered post-cyberpunk, but really is on the same spectrum, and again, LA. Including an opening scene with pizza delivery by car with a 30-minute guarantee, except that the protag works for the mafia, so it's 30 minutes where the Don will personally apologize and you will come from the you'll come from the experience feeling like you owe the mafia. What happens to the delivery person who made the Don do this is never mentioned. And yeah, so it's something where it's kind of weird because when I think of film aesthetic that's cyberpunk, which I mean a future that is negative, uh, has tech that is portrayed as simultaneously useful but also repressive. The example that I gave on Mastodon is that the metaverse in Snow Crash is clearly useful for people. The Matrix in Matrix the film, I think Reloaded was filmed in Sydney, but the original Matrix was Chicago. They have it's Chicago in aesthetic. They literally list you Chicago street intersections. Like, well, there's a phone at Wells and Lake. You can make it. I think the Wachowskis are Chicago. Bound is set in Chicago. In Sense8, one of the eight mains lives in Chicago for that reason. Like they're Chicago anchored. Yeah, the Matrix doesn't show the sprawl. Doesn't show sprawl. I mean the Matrix not from the film, but from Neuromancer, the book, from which of course the film took so much inspiration. Oh yeah. But the point is that the Matrix in the book feels a little weird, mostly because it was written in the 80s when software was only starting to be a thing, and William Gibson said that he took a lot of inspiration from video games, from like video arcades at the time, to the point that it's never made clear what exactly the data is for, but it clearly does something. No. No. So I do right. So as I said, cyberpunk I think is distinct from dystopia because the metaverse is useful. The metaverse is shown as useful for the general public. There's high-speed pizza delivery, and yeah, this is like a kind of like more extreme version of like convenience that was available in the early '90s when Snow Crash was being written. When Domino's started the '90s had the 30-minute guarantee. Yeah, and the distinction is that the dystopian canon never shows you useful tech. So when I think of dystopian canon in English, it's the two most important books are Brave New World in 1984. Neither of them has any tech that is useful for the general public. The telescreen is never shown as providing any kind of entertainment. The telescreen is shown as exclusively providing propaganda and surveillance. At no point when they talk about the machine written books that are produced for the proles, and they're always made sure to be portrayed as the stupidest thing ever. It's never escapist entertainment. That is never there with the telescreen. The speak right is never shown as automating anything interesting. 1984 literally has no useful tech for the for people as opposed to the party. Brave New World has designer babies in vats, and that is portrayed as like a horrible thing. And Huxley doesn't care about women very much. Like the way he like like a lot of male canon authors cannot write women, and views like the sexual liberation provided by this as another example of something entirely negative. Like there's nothing about how you actually like there's nothing there about any kind of liberation from drudgery. The Soma is viewed as again entirely negative. This is dystopian canon. Cyberpunk shows you useful tech, I think is the difference. But useful tech while your life is owned by mega corporations that, in the style of 1980s Japanese conglomerates, do everything. So very high inequality, and also a very tech-focused story. Like the hackers are really important always in this. if there's like a resistance movement, it will be individual hackers rather than union organizers. That's something that the genre has always struggled with. I think also the depiction of the refugees, the raft in Snow Crash, is not very good, and I think Octavia Butler does it better. In that, in declining America, a declining America is not one that refugees can come to without being border controlled. A declining America is one that refugees don't want to come to. In fact, instead want to leave. And so that is what I think of cyberpunk as a genre. Solarpunk, I don't think it's exactly utopian. I think of Solarpunk as stories about future tech that is resolving certain problems. Again, I wouldn't call it just trees on glass buildings, which is kind of weird that the images that I'm seeing are trees on glass buildings. Because, again, Singapore is cyberpunk with trees. And steampunk, I wouldn't say steampunk is somewhere in between. Steampunk is optimistic to the point of portraying like Victorian-style explorers with the classism and the racism and the colonialism somehow written away. I'm forgetting what RPG it is that has a club of like explorers that is said to be cross-class, and as a note to the GM they said, yes, we are aware that people of different classes would never interact like this, would never socialize like this in the Victorian era. We need this for like game reasons, like essentially to let players pick characters and have them reasons to stick together. Oh god. Yeah. And I would say that the negative equivalent of steampunk is dieselpunk. Dieselpunk is much grittier. Often by people who are looking for excuses to draw people in Nazi uniforms looking cute. Like somehow dieselpunk is never the Sherman tank. Like it is kind of cringe to like do anti-fascism the way it actually was practiced. I mean, it's I mean obviously way more people killed, way more Nazis, to the tune of the Star Spangled Banner or God Save the King, than Bella Ciao. And now I'm trying to think how many orders of magnitude separate these two groups. Or the Internationale, but often these were the people being killed by the Nazis because Stalin was rather incompetent, but that's neither here nor there. And yeah, so anyway, what I'm trying to say is that you want good transit, I mean, Taipei. And this is in a country that has the highest construction cost in a non-English speaking first world democracy. I think they're actually worse than the Netherlands. And maybe Taipei and Amsterdam are about even on this, but Amsterdam has the excuse of, oh my god, the geology. Taipei doesn't. I think Budapest may have higher construction costs, but whether it is a democracy is I wouldn't say debatable because there's no debate. It kind of isn't at this point. So yeah, Taiwan. So despite having a kind of undersized system because they can't build, this is not bad models, but like Berlin is 33, I think, or 34. New York is about, depending on what you count as suburbs of New York is between 30 and 33. And again, smaller cities just don't play. Like literally, I can show you England and Wales. Again, I don't know what it's like in Scotland. Let me not have video for a moment. Just because of the frozen thing, the top half. Okay, so in England, oh, we have percentages. Okay, that helps. So not in employment is about 35%. So mentally up every number you say by a factor of 1.5. So England wide it's 10.6%. So it's about 16ish% took one of these modes of transport to work in 2011. Unfortunately, I only see this at the census level. The census is every year ending in a 1, so the next is 2021, which is during Corona, so the numbers are all wacky, and by wacky I mean much lower. So anyway, this should be about 16. And then, let's see, Met counties are often not terrible, by which I mean 9, and this is Manchester, so more unemployment, so maybe, I don't know, 15-ish. This is Liverpool, so 10%. Even more unemployment, so again, about 16 point something. You might be able to tell that the, like, actually not urban numbers are much lower, and then if you want to see where in England people actually do take the train, okay, this is Birmingham, so 9.7. How much unemployment? Worse than the others, okay. Okay, so London is this. And remember, it's not 31.6 divided by 100, it's 31.6 divided by 65.4. So this is the proportion of people in London, like Greater London, the city, not the city of London, but the city, Greater London, who take public transport to work. Nearly half. And then you look at the suburbs, like which of these count as suburbs, it's like kind of your call, and you can kind of tell where these suburbs are because they have high train usage. So for example, Norfolk and Suffolk are pretty far, so not a lot of people take the train. Hertfordshire has quite high train usage, or Essex, especially the parts of Essex that are maybe closer to London. And Epping Forest is where the Central Line ends. So instead of taking a commuter train, people will take the tube. And again, you can see the same with all the suburbs. I think London, with a reasonable definition of commuter belt, is maybe low to mid 30s, is mid 30s, let's say. I don't think it's as defined administratively as something like Ile-de-France, or something like Taipei plus Xinbei plus Keelung plus Taoyuan. You can see it with like, maybe Sussex is too far and Hampshire is too far, but Kent has a lot of commuter suburbs. Surrey, of course. The point is that public transport, and we're saying this, yeah, Hertfordshire is very urbanized, but it's entirely home county commuting. I mean, the urbanization in Hertfordshire is not, oh, there's a not very large city there, like in the sense that Manchester or even Cambridge is a large city. It's London suburbs, Hertfordshire. And so anyway, that was the English issue, and this is the French. So departments, active populations, I'm forgetting what means this. Number 4 is cars, number 5 is public transport. So France writ large is 15%, this is of 2014. I think I saw numbers go up a little bit in the subsequent 5 years. I don't think I've seen post-corona numbers. And if you wonder, this is of course Paris, the actually high number. And then outer suburbs of Paris, outer suburbs of Paris, and these are inner suburbs of Paris. I believe it's a clean cleave, but maybe Rouen. No, that's a clean cleave. Right? Yeah, it looks like every department in Ile-de-France beats every department not in Ile-de-France. Well, this is Lyon. Yeah, no, public transport. So I'm showing you countries that are maybe very capital centric. So maybe it's mostly big cities because the investment is in the capital. Uh, but also, I mean, in Germany, Berlin. It's hard to say because model splits in Germany aren't computed that way. But in Berlin, there's much lower car usage than in the rest of Germany. Munich is more car oriented than Berlin, much less car oriented than where people actually go to. Um, Frankfurt is, I think, on the auto-oriented side by the standards of a large German city, but that's the standards of a large German city. I think the model splits we're talking about, and let's say the Hamburg, the Stuttgarts, things like that. Like cities plus suburbs, probably in the 20s. Berlin is again low to mid 30s, depending on what you define as the Umland. I think Berlin and all of Bonn both together are maybe 32%, 31 or 32%. Uh, and so the point is that you want public transit, you need big cities. Um, and yeah, you can have a lower gradient, which is the case in Germany. It's especially the case in Switzerland, but even in Switzerland, I mean, yeah, in Zurich they have high uh, public transport usage, and then outside Zurich they have lower public transport usage. Like there is a certain level of urbanization that you need for this. Um, so it gets to the point that like a solar pump future is very much a you live in like maybe it doesn't have to be a Tokyo or Seoul, but like a Berlin at least. And then you take the train to you know the city, the Paris, the Warszawa, the Cape the Amsterdam, things like that, the München. And fortunately, it does bother me, but I need to admit that in my positive but not entirely magical vision of the future, Bavaria has not been depopulated. So München still exists. And Cesu still exists. I mean, hopefully, maybe it's not winning elections always, but it still exists. And yeah, so I bring all this up because there is this kind of tension between an aesthetic that likes smallness, they like small communes, um, and they also like public transport. But public transport is not a thing for small communes. It is a thing for Taipei. It is a thing for. I mean, look at the ridership by city here, or here. I just X'd, I guess, the model splits for France and for England and Wales. So it really is a matter of it really is a matter of um, being more comfortable, I think, with size. Like the thing is, in Berlin, there are things to walk to. Yeah, I guess there are people who think that it's like too big or too overwhelming, and I know a lot of people have had that reaction to New York. People who think that New York is too large, New York is too overwhelming. There are too many people. Um, they don't want to be. They don't want to go to Manhattan. Okay, then stay in Queens, but take the fucking subway. Um, or stay in the Bronx, but take the fucking subway. And the point is that you need a city. Again, it doesn't have to be the size of New York, but there is a certain minimum size that you need in order to be able to support a walkable city where the walking is done by residents, as opposed to by tourists. Like there's absolutely a thing. I think it's an Italian thing mainly. Not mainly, but Italy is maybe the most famous for it, where you have all these picturesque little towns. They can like make up names and probably get things like that. It's not so ignore that I have things about Palestine and anything like Palestrina is just the one that I remember because of the name, but uh, it's also a suburb of Rome. Uh, and so I mean, it's like a charming little street like this, like a step street, and like a lot of these charming little, usually not classical, like usually the actually preserved classical stuff will just be ruined, but stuff like, but medieval, early Renaissance, um, cores in a bunch of these cities. I mean, Pisa here. Pisa is not even that small. I mean, there are way smaller places in Italy. Again, they have these little picturesque town squares with a lot of history and a farmer's market, and the only people who go there are tourists because actual Italians will drive to the hypermarket where the prices are much lower. And all of them drive, and outside the pedestrian city square, you think that these places would not be autocentric with their streets that are barely wide enough for two cars to pass. They will still have two cars passing, and then if you have, and maybe they will have, half a meter of sidewalk width, a meter of sidewalk width. Um, I think it was, maybe it was Old Urbanist. It was talking about Firenze. And Firenze is large enough to have like actual public transport. He was saying that there are a bunch of places that look from a distance like they should be kind of car free, but really aren't. Um, yeah. So right. So I don't actually know that tradition very well. So when I'm thinking of solarpunk, I'm thinking of again something that I know through Germans and things that I know through some Americans. Uh, so I would not call it pastoral. Uh, it's it's more urban than that. It's not usually going out to the woods. Um, it's more small city than I would say than actually pastoral. It's um, so I don't have a lot of names of German cities memorized to the point that they could tell you. You're seeing me struggle with Italy to the point that I'm using Palestrina or Pisa as examples, um, where the rather than many more random Tuscan towns. Uh, but so it's places that are that scale, like this scale. Like I mean, Pisa. I mean, this is how many people live in Pisa. It's things like this. And again, the problem is when I think of the history of Germany, I think about things like Bayreuth just because of its importance to German nationalism. Like, I mean, I have a certain name, and there's a reason why when I think of German history, I think of like a very specific period in history in which your people, I think, got to see Germany, like flew to Germany a lot, but didn't land usually. Um, yeah, so re-Southern European thing. Spain has a pretty high model split. Um, Spain, and speaking of Spain having a high model split, it's driven by Madrid and Barcelona. Like Madrid and Barcelona have high model splits that I can't really compare because I got the numbers in 2021 during Corona, and somehow the model split in Spain in 2021 during Corona was about comparable to the UK, France, and Germany not during Corona, and likewise, I think Barcelona was maybe low 30s or mid 30s during Corona, and Madrid was maybe a little less than that during Corona. No, Spain is generally different. Spain is much less suburbanized. Um, the weighted density with one by one kilometer squares can be computed. I mean, even for countries. And in Europe, the highest weighted density is by far Spain. Number two, pretty distant second, but also ahead of everyone else is Greece. I don't remember number three because it's a near tie between like four different countries. Um, and oh yeah, cars and cities, yes. Um, yes, but also Barcelona is not. I mean, yeah, there's the old town, but Barcelona is a grid with wide streets. Like Eixample is uh, not at all what you expect of a Southern European town center, because usually, I mean, Southern European town centers, what we're talking about, like, I mean, this is Milano. Milano has streets that are so narrow that they had to invent a new way of building metros in the 50s, which is called either the Milan method or cover and cut, where you build cut and cover metros vertically downward, because previously you had to build them down at an angle to avoid cave-ins. But you could build at an angle if you're building under a wide Manhattan Avenue or a wide Osmanian Parisian boulevard. You can't build that way around here. It's too narrow. So they figured out how to sink the retaining walls during early digging, um, almost like you're doing part of the covering before you complete cutting. And that's how they built they built M1 and M2 cut and cover. I'm forgetting which line this is. Yeah, they're also not telling me. And that's how they built M1 and M2 very cheaply, and then they built M3 at a more normal European cost due to corruption. And then they had to switch to bored tunnel because they ran out of piazze. You can't build stations in such narrow spaces, so the stations, so you might be able to see here from where the stations are, the station is never random straight place, it's always a piazza. Because the stations had to get more space. So this is Milano, and of course Roma is Roma, and this is Barcelona. Yeah, this is Eixample. So the whole point of Barcelona is it's a grid. The grid is anti-aligned with the compass points. The streets of the grid are on the wide side, it's about 20 meters, which is Manhattan. Manhattan is 60 feet on the streets, so 18 meters. And then the major streets and the avenues are 100 feet, so 30 meters. I don't have formal enough urbanist training to have memorized anything like this in the Eixample. I'm just checking. So this is much wider than that. Generally, European cities have more standard deviation of street widths than American cities. Like Parisian boulevards are generally wider than Broadway. I think the only street in New York that is Parisian Boulevard in width is Queens Boulevard, aka Boulevard of Death, from how much traffic there is there. So anyway, yeah, this is Eixample. It's very different from like standard Southern European town center. Madrid, of course, doesn't have that. Madrid is less dense than Barcelona. Yeah, London. Yeah, so London. I mean, honestly, speaking of steampunk, part of what I think of steampunk aesthetics is late 19th century London, or like late. It doesn't have to be late. Second half of 19th century London, to the point that if you're trying to tell a story in that era that is very clearly about the Wilhelmine ring, uh, I would consider it to at least some extent to be a subversion. Like if you're trying to tell an explicitly German or explicitly French or whatever story. Yeah. Some of the places, yeah. Barcelona has a bunch of narrow street neighborhoods. Just yeah. I mean, Manhattan has narrow streets in Lower Manhattan. Again, Madrid is maybe more typical, but like it's not like first of all, it's not a medieval city center because Madrid is not a medieval city. First of all, medieval Spain did not exist. No, literally, generally what is considered the end of the medieval epoch is the combo of the marriage of the Catholic monarchs, the completion of the Conquista, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, the publication of the first grammar of a European language, the grammar of the Spanish language, and the first Columbus voyage. And I think other than the marriage, all of them happened within about a year of each other, around 1492. And Madrid did not exist then. Castile, I mean, Barcelona existed for Aragon, but for Castile, it was a moving court. And they only settled in Madrid either late 16th or early 17th century. That's when they built the permanent capital there. And so, and this is why Spanish real geography so bad, because historically it was cities that were all, or almost all, on the water, plus Madrid in the center. Yeah, plus a couple more that are on rivers, but so much stuff right on or right next to the coast, and then the capital. It's a very bad structure of that city. And then you have Italy, where you can kind of fit most of the biggest cities on one line, like Torino to Milano, and then to Bologna, Firenze, Roma, Napoli. Uh, yeah. So the point is that the what looks to you as a tourist like a small auto, like not auto free, but like walkable place where you have all these charming little small businesses and a lot of history, in Prato, Pistoia, like all of these places. That's a tourist experience. The locals don't do that. And maybe, and I mean, I was talking about German solar parks. This is me maybe slagging on Americans more than on Germans, because a lot of Americans say, "Oh, everyone talks about how great these little tourist towns are abroad." Oh yes, because they're walkable. But here's the thing: an American who is visiting this part of Italy, yes, they walk a lot because they're a tourist. Work, like high value added work of the kind that can pay you enough money that you can regularly travel between the United States and Europe, is not especially walkable, or in most of these places transit oriented. Now it can be transit oriented if you have a big city center, but that's when we're starting to get into places of the scale, not of random Tuscan towns, but of, again, Milano, Zurich, München, Prague, Vienna, of course Berlin is bigger, Paris, London, and so so there's, I think, a tension between that kind of aesthetic and the fact that to kind of be able to afford that aesthetic, you need let's call it more green neoliberal mentality, maybe, is the better way to view it, I think. Like one in which, okay, you can do things to reduce inequality, but it's okay to build more housing, it's okay to build more high-rise housing, it's okay to build more high-rise housing in places that people think are beloved parks. And I think that is kind of the tension between that aesthetic and greenness, and it comes from the need for public transit. There is a graphic novel that I read a couple years ago, 2022 I think, that is like increasingly put on reading lists. It's kind of like one of the graphic novels that it's okay to read even if you're not into comics, alongside Mouse. I don't think it is at all like Mouse, and it's called Genderqueer, by Maya Kobapa. And it kind of opens with that aesthetic where Maya and her family grew up in basically a commune. Is there like any picture of this? Where they, where, yeah, I mean, it grew up in a commune. No, not a commune. I mean, no, it was like, I think it was more like a cabin in the woods with like the family had their own diesel generator, and I think they sent and her, I think, sister Phoebe to a Waldorf school, to like an anthroposophic school, and I was reading them thinking, were they vaccinated? And it's kind of like very hippie cabin in the woods mentality. Again, very different from Solarpunk, but I think Solarpunk sometimes dialogues too much with the cabin in the woods type of environmentalism, and not enough with, oh yeah, I mean, I have an environmentally friendly lifestyle. I fly, but not very often. I live in in the center of a large city. My electricity comes from solar and wind. I take the trains everywhere. I don't even know how to drive, and the trains do go everywhere because it's a large enough city that you can actually. So I shouldn't say profitably build them, even though the U-Bahn did operationally break even pre-corona, but you can let's call it socially profitably built. Like, I mean, if you try to do a benefit cost analysis of building new U-Bahn lines, I think the benefit cost analyses here are excessively negative. But if you try to maybe sanity check yourself by retrospective benefit cost analysis, if people don't know what I'm talking about, it is. Uh, I know that I know that I know that it's full of typos. This one, an ex-post CBA for the Stockholm Metro. Uh, uh, so, do they talk about the benefit? Like, they have very high benefit cost ratios. Uh, and I don't remember the number. I think it's 6. Um, there's a link. I believe there's a link to a non-gated version in our Sweden case. I tried to make sure that all of the links that I can give are also here. And yes, I'm aware of the typo. I think all of these are accessible on the internet, or were when I checked them. Yeah, so the benefit cost rate. So if you look at the benefit cost ratios, and if you try to do that, then yeah, obviously you can build a lot more U-Bahn lines in Berlin. You can build a lot more U-Bahn lines in München. You can expand tramways in Leipzig. Expand the tram and the various Stadtbahn systems in Köln, Frankfurt, and so on. You can build more S-Bahn tunnels. I mean, I'm pretty sure the second S-Bahn line that they're building in München, despite the horrific cost overruns, still clears the benefit cost ratio, which is kind of astounding for a line that is setting cost records for, not English speaking world and not a tin pot dictatorship. Or not like a third world country that is outsourcing the state to Japan and is getting Japanese costs in exchange rate terms and then has to pay them in depreciated taka. To give a very specific example of such a country, when naming that specific currency, and so despite the very high cost, it's going to clear benefit cost. Like it does help the economy in Munich. So it's something that can be built, and once you're there, you don't think about it very much. I mean, yeah, of course you complain about the train a lot. It's pretty normal to complain about train delays. I literally did that when I got here. Regardless of whether you're watching Twitch or YouTube. If you're watching on Twitch, you know when I started. If you're watching on YouTube, you did see that we started at 1930 my time, and normally we start 1910. Yeah, I mean, train delays happen. Nobody thinks, oh my god, I live in a country with such wonderful trains. Not even in Japan do people think that. I mean, I lived in Singapore and I certainly didn't think that. So, I mean, hell, when I visit Switzerland, I notice the train delays. Of course, because I do this for a living, I can also notice I can notice things that work. Like maybe I can see how things connect very well to each other if I'm seeing a timed connection, or maybe I'm seeing something about how the tramways are set up that is very positive. But it's not something that is very noticeable if you're not in the industry, and it's not that big an industry. The whole point of public transport efficiency. Yeah. Did Bavaria privatize? No. Germany does not. No. It's CSU corruption. So CSU has two problems. The first is they've been in power continuously in Bavaria. In general, when one party is in power continuously, this does lead to higher corruption levels because it is cheaper to be corrupt. There's a paper by Branko Milanovic about this in the context of Eastern Europe, where the paper finds that more frequent changes in the governing party in the 90s and maybe also early 2000s subsequently led to lower corruption levels and better outcomes, just because when there are frequent changes in who's in power, it's harder to be corrupt because they need to bribe both parties. And of course, party power is a zero-sum game, which means each party is going to know that you are paying off the other one, so it is much harder to gain from corruption. So this is also why I don't think it's a coincidence that the really bad examples that we all know of corruption parties in Western Europe are parties that have been continuously in power. So Democrazia Cristiana in Italy was a corruption party, and that is related to the fact that it ran the country continuously from the end of World War II, basically, to the 1980s when they finally lost to Crashi. But Crashi was part of the same combine. They would govern with different coalitions sometimes. So sometimes the coalitions would also include the Socialist Party, and sometimes they would not. So the Socialist Party was kind of bought into the system eventually. So Crashi was also incredibly corrupt. But fundamentally, you would bribe the same people. Of course, in Japan, the LDP. The other big corruption case in Western Europe is the Austrian People's Party, because of the way the proports system works in Austria, and they had very common grand coalitions, and that meant that that transformed ÖVP into essentially a corruption party, and it got to the fact that courts basically had to flee the country. And they might still win re-election. It's about even whether there is a coalition in the polls without them. So SPÖ, the Greens, NEOS. So no, that's just straight out corruption. Borners, have you read my most recent post? The one about militarized capitals, because it's another example of corruption that specifically does not involve privatizing to international consultants. It's corruption, it's domestic corruption in Myanmar and Egypt. And in Bayern it's kind of the same thing. Not for nothing. Construction costs in München are not especially high. Construction costs for München U-Bahn expansion are the same as in the rest of Germany. Construction costs for Nuremberg U-Bahn expansion are actually very low. I'm not sure why, to be honest. But the S-Bahn is where the construction costs are exploding. Partly it's just harder to build, but also this is a priority project for CSU, because the S-Bahn is how you get from the suburbs of München to the city. So center-right voting suburbanites like this. So it's a priority for CSU to make sure that it happens. So yeah, they will pay. They will have a lot of side payments, a lot of extras, just because it's politically important to them. Whereas U-Bahn expansion is more city-driven, and the city is run by SPD and the Greens. And this is it's a part of single party. It's part of dominant party corruption, plus the fact that they consider it like a must build, so people can profiteer off of them. Like they're not going to say no. That's the issue with the München S-Bahn, with München S-Bahn Stabsstrecke. Like it's that thing. Yeah. I mean, there's a mentality that big cities are bad, and I think it's because big cities are where it's first of all where people make money, but also where people visibly make money. People who make money by driving to an office park are less visible, and it's something that that it's been explained to me on Discord, that it depends on what part of the finance industry, and I no longer remember which parts cluster in cities in which don't, but there are hedge funds, or maybe they're hedge funds, maybe they're different things. I don't know. But there are big elements in finance that don't need to cluster in city centers, and therefore in the New York region, they just exist in office parks in very rich regions, like in suburban Connecticut, for example. And you don't see them as suburban because they're far. I mean, if you live there, sure, but if you live there, you're probably pretty rich yourself. And then other finance firms have to take city centers, and that's where you have all these corporate HQs. So if you're in New York, regardless of your income, like very high wealth by the finance industry is there in your face, and that's true in. Now, New York is a very high inequality city, but this is also true in much lower inequality places like in Paris. I don't think it's actually correct that agglomeration economics apply to crime, and where it's a very common take. New York does not have higher crime rate than the rest of the United States, for example. Like New York, I think there was the flip happened sometime last decade, but the New York homicide rate fell below the U.S. average. Berlin is elevated by German standards. I think Munich is below German average. U.S. is an outlier because you mean New York has money to pay for cops and the rest of the U.S. doesn't? I mean, okay, but for example, New York also has money to pay for teachers, and yet it doesn't, and its education outcomes are good by American inner city standards, but kind of meh by general Americans. So it's not just that. Like it's, I mean, there is an issue of village communities having like tolerating very high levels of violence. That is the thing. So anyway, no. So with big cities, it's not like they produce more inequality, right? I mean, yes, Singapore has kind of disgusting inequality, but in the places that kind of embrace giant cities, which is mostly Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, the inequality is not especially high. Like, I mean, Japan, like how unequal are these three countries? Are the three East Asian democracies? Okay, so this is Japan. This is marginally more unequal than Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. Okay, this is more unequal. This is like Italy level of inequality, and this is same as, so year in, year out, we're saying about 0.3, 0.31. Okay, and okay, Germany. France, and the United Kingdom. Like it's not like the presence of large cities in preference to smaller scale urbanism. And this is Switzerland. In preference to smaller scale urbanism, produces higher inequality. It just is much more in your face. Yeah, I mean, exactly. Inequality doesn't come from urban policy. Inequality comes from things like labor empowerment. It comes from taxes, like the overall level, and also how progressive the system is. It comes from universal and means-tested benefits. I mean, like the United States has high inequality not because of cars. I mean, I think the cars maybe make it harder for the very poor people to have access to work, but remember, 92% of American households own cars. Most poor Americans own cars. Bad cars. Beaters, but cars. In the United States, the reason they have high inequality is, have you seen their fucking healthcare system? I mean, not just, but that's kind of the most emblematic of where you're getting to a point where it's on that specific issue where it's now you get the Democrats being to the right of Cecil. UK, I mean, yeah, honestly, even in the UK, I would disagree with you. The differences within I mean, for the exact same link that I just asked. I mean, the like UK inequality shot up under Maggie and then Major, and then went back down under Blair, Brown, and then again under the new Tories. Not because the new Tories were anti-inequality, they just kind of wrecked London finance. So like that kind of reduction in inequality or increase in inequality is something that happened entirely through what Maggie did to the NHS and into the welfare state, and how she shifted taxes through cutting taxes through cutting the high income tax levels and instituting and then increasing VAT. Mass privatizations under her and under Major, and then Blair and Brown quietly implemented welfare schemes while constantly talking about how to get people off of welfare. Uh, and that was entirely without changes to the planning laws in the UK. So it's not. I mean, the fact that London and its commuter belt have like 14 or 15 million people and not 25 million people. Yeah, that's planning problems. That is reducing the economic efficiency of the United Kingdom. But I don't think it's increasing inequality. I think it's just inequality neutral. I mean, place-based policy has that effect in general. Like, place-based policy, in general, tries to reduce inequality, but doesn't actually, because essentially it moves income from the big city middle class to the petite bourgeoisie of small towns and rural areas, and these are groups that essentially have the same income, so it doesn't actually do anything on inequality. But anyway, do people have questions? Because I kind of made my point about about Solarpunk, where there really is the tension between the aesthetic and the kind of big public transit systems that are required to northern labor. I mean, sure, but I would not say labor in the same way, say northern, in the same way that in Germany, there are different SPD. There are different SPDs by state, and for example, the eastern SPDs are kind of Putinist. Like in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, it's an SPD. It's an SPD leader who is very supportive still of Nord Stream 2. Sure, right, but I mean, yes, but my understanding is that my understanding is that the younger people are not, the children of the landlords, but people who went to but people who maybe even read PPE, but if they didn't, went to Oxbridge, which is a different class. And again, in Germany, it's kind of different because actually I don't think it's different. Like, it is kind of a place of professional politicians, but sorry. But yeah, no, I mean but there really is that kind of, I wouldn't say disjunction. I mean, between things that kind of make the inequality clear and things that actually resolve it, if that makes sense. Generally decentralization is not going to solve inequality. Again, I shouldn't sit like some very high level, but it's also toward lower level. It's not like you're not going to. I mean, there's a reason utopian socialism went nowhere in the 19th century. But anyway, I'm going to take one more round of questions. I used to have much less lag in this apartment, but I guess it's back to over 15 seconds, and if not, then we can break. Temperature outside is very much a must stay hydrated at all costs. Which I want to blame global warming for, but we're at like, what is it, 1 degree off of pre-industrial levels? Like the current temperature minus 1 degree is not pleasant. Anyway, if there are no further questions, then we can break. Thank you all for watching. I did warn you guys in advance that I was going to do it before I end up being late, so thanks for bearing with me. I don't think I'm streaming in 3 days, but certainly if not, in a week. So I'll see you, and